I'm the youngest of four siblings, with a 9-year gap between me and my closest brother, Ethan. Growing up, I always felt like an afterthought in my own family. My siblings were all dealing with something: chronic illnesses, mental health struggles, academic problems. You name it, they had it. And me? I was the quiet one, the easy kid who didn't need constant monitoring or special care. My parents, Rachel and Mark, were always stretched thin, juggling doctor appointments, school meetings, and whatever new crisis popped up. I get it, I really do. But understanding it doesn't make it hurt any less. I wasn't mistreated, not exactly. They fed me, gave me a roof over my head, and I had all the basics covered. But emotionally, I might as well have been invisible. It's like I was the background character in my own home. Nobody asked about my day, my dreams, or how I felt. If I got an A on a test or participated in a school event, it was met with a distracted, "That's nice, hon," before they turned their attention back to whoever's crisis was the loudest that day. At some point, I stopped trying to be seen. I stayed in my room, read books, played video games, and learned to enjoy my own company. It was easier than trying to fight for scraps of attention. The weird thing is, I wasn't even mad about it most of the time. I figured that's just how things were. But the loneliness was a constant hum in the back of my mind, something I didn't have words for until much later. I had two close friends, Maddie and Zoe, who kind of saved me from going completely numb. We met in middle school, and it was like we all recognized something broken in each other. Maddie's parents were divorced and constantly fighting, while Zoe's family was so neglectful she might as well have been living alone. We clicked instantly, forming this little makeshift family that felt more real to me than my actual one. High school was more of the same. My parents were so busy keeping Ethan out of trouble and managing my sister Sarah's health issues that I basically coasted through those years unnoticed. I got good grades, stayed out of trouble, and didn't cause any extra stress. I think they thought I was fine because I wasn't actively falling apart. But being fine isn't the same as being happy or supported. By the time I was 18, I had stopped expecting anything from them. When it came time for college, I was ready to leave. My grandma, bless her, had been quietly saving money for my education because she knew my parents wouldn't prioritize it. She was the one who helped me apply to schools, file my paperwork, and make sure I had everything I needed. My parents didn't even know what school I ended up going to until I told them the week before I moved out. They acted surprised, like they didn't realize I was serious about leaving. I remember my mom saying, "Oh, we thought you'd stay local." Nope. I packed my bags, hugged them goodbye, and didn't look back. College was the best thing that ever happened to me. Maddie and Zoe ended up going to the same university, and for the first time, I felt like I was building a life that was really mine. My parents would text every now and then, usually just surface-level stuff. "How's school? Are you eating enough?" Basic parental pleasantries, but never anything deeper. They never visited, never asked about my friends or what classes I was taking. I could have dropped out and moved to another country, and I doubt they would have noticed. After graduation, Maddie, Zoe, and I decided to move to a different state together. We pooled our money, rented a little apartment, and started our lives as real adults. I got a decent job, Maddie started working for a nonprofit, and Zoe went into marketing. We were happy, stable, independent. And my relationship with my parents? Practically non-existent. I'd get a text from my mom, maybe once every 2 months. My dad didn't text or call at all. The disconnect really hit me one Thanksgiving a couple of years after I graduated. Out of nowhere, my mom called me. Actually called, which was weird because we never spoke on the phone. I remember looking at her name on my screen and feeling this pit in my stomach, like something bad had happened. I answered, and she said, "What time are you coming home for Thanksgiving dinner?" I sat there for a second, trying to process her words. Thanksgiving dinner? We had never done a proper family Thanksgiving in my entire life. The few times we did celebrate, it was thrown together at the last minute, usually ending in some kind of argument. I told her I already had plans. I did. Maddie, Zoe, and I had booked a cabin for the long weekend months in advance. But my mom acted like I had personally betrayed her. She said something about how she was going to be alone because my dad was visiting Ethan, who was now in a long-term care facility a couple of hours away. I felt bad for her. I really did. But at the same time, She gave me 3 days' notice. I lived 2 states away, and plane tickets weren't exactly cheap at the last minute. I tried to explain, but she cut me off and said, "You just don't care about your family, do you?" before hanging up on me. I sat there holding my phone, feeling this mix of guilt and anger swirling in my chest. Was I supposed to have known they were planning something? Was I supposed to have psychic powers to anticipate this? I scrolled through our old messages just to double-check, and nope. No mention of Thanksgiving, no invitation, nothing. Just a random expectation that I would show up and drop everything. I ended up sending her a text later that night, trying to smooth things over. I said I was sorry for the miscommunication, but I already had plans for Christmas too. I offered to visit after the holidays if they wanted. She never replied. That interaction sat heavy with me for days. I kept replaying the conversation, trying to figure out if I was the bad guy. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. I hadn't done anything wrong. I wasn't the one who let our relationship wither into nothing. I wasn't the one who acted like my child's life was an afterthought. A few weeks later, just as I was starting to let it go, I got a text from my dad. And it wasn't just any text. It was a threat. "If you don't come home for Christmas, I'm cutting off your college funding." At first, I actually laughed when I read the text from my dad. Cutting off my college funding? I had graduated years ago, and he hadn't paid a cent toward my tuition. My grandmother had covered everything. Part of me thought he was just confused, maybe texting the wrong kid or forgetting what year it was. "So," I replied, politely but firmly, reminding him that I had already graduated and that Grandma had been the one to pay for my education. I even added a little joke about checking his bank account in case someone had been scamming him. I figured that would be the end of it. It wasn't. A few hours later, he fired back with a long-winded rant about how I was selfish, ungrateful, and turning my back on the family. He wrote about how he and Mom had sacrificed so much for me and my siblings, and how I was disrespecting everything they had given me. The thing is, I couldn't think of a single thing they had actually given me, aside from basic survival necessities. Emotional support? Nope. Guidance? Forget it. They didn't even know what my major was in college until after I graduated. I sat there staring at my phone, a tight knot forming in my chest. Was this supposed to guilt me into coming home for Christmas? Did they honestly think this approach would work? I typed out a response, deleted it, retyped it, and deleted it again. Finally, I settled on something simple and calm. I said I was sorry he felt that way, but Grandma had paid for my college, and I wasn't going to change my plans for Christmas. I reminded him that I was open to catching up after the holidays if they wanted to. His next reply came quickly and felt colder than the last one. "If you don't come home, don't bother coming back at all." That one hit harder than I expected. My dad had always been emotionally distant, but this was a new level of harsh. I sat there for a long time, just staring at the screen, rereading the words. There was so much I wanted to say, about how they'd ignored me for years, how I had felt invisible in my own home, how they didn't get to act like they cared now just because they wanted something from me. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I put my phone down and tried to push the whole thing out of my mind. I thought that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. Over the next few days, the messages kept coming, this time from my mom. Long, rambling texts about how disappointed she was in me, how she couldn't understand why I was being so distant, and how they had always tried their best with me. She wrote about how hard things were for them with Ethan and Sarah, how stressed they were, and how they just needed me to step up for the family. That phrase, "step up for the family," stuck with me. It felt so loaded, like a veiled command dressed up as a plea. Where was this energy when I was a kid? Where was this emotional investment when I was sitting alone in my room, feeling like an outsider in my own home? I showed the text to Maddie and Zoe one night while we were having dinner. Maddie frowned as she scrolled through them, her lips pressed into a tight line. "They're not asking you to visit for the holidays because they miss you," she said finally. "They want something from you. This feels strategic." Zoe didn't mince words. She rarely did. "They're trying to manipulate you. Don't let them pull you back in. You don't owe them anything, Liv." I nodded, but the knot in my chest didn't loosen. A few days later, my dad tried calling me. He never called. Ever. I let it go to voicemail, and when I listened to the message, it was more of the same. Guilt, disappointment, and subtle threats wrapped up in his gruff voice. "You're making a mistake, Olivia. You're going to regret this. Family is everything." The irony of that statement wasn't lost on me. Family is everything? Really? Because it sure didn't feel like that when I was growing up. After that voicemail, I stopped responding entirely. I needed space. I needed to breathe without feeling like I was carrying the weight of their expectations on my shoulders. But, of course, it didn't end there. About a week later, I got a call from my older brother, Ethan. We hadn't spoken in over a year. Ethan had always been a complicated figure in my life. He struggled with a lot: addiction, mental health issues, and a series of bad decisions that left him in and out of various facilities over the years. He was the problem child, and growing up, he consumed so much of our parents' time and energy that there was rarely anything left for the rest of us. "Hey, Liv," he said when I picked up. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "Look, I know things are messy right now, but Mom and Dad are really struggling. They're scared about the future. They don't know what's going to happen to Sarah or me if something happens to them." I closed my eyes and pinched the bridge of my nose. Here it was. The real reason for all the sudden attention. They weren't just upset about the holidays. They were worried about what would happen when they weren't around anymore. And apparently, I was their solution. "Ethan, I'm sorry you're in this position," I said carefully, "but I can't be the one to fix everything. I have my own life now." "I get that," he said softly, "but you're the only one who's stable, you know? The rest of us are a mess." Stable. That word stung more than it should have. I wasn't stable because my life was easy. I was stable because I had clawed my way out of the chaos and built something for myself. I had fought for this peace. We hung up not long after, and I sat in my apartment staring at the wall, feeling equal parts sad and furious. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. They had ignored me for years, and now, because I was the only one who had managed to keep my head above water, they wanted me to be the safety net. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation over and over in my mind. No matter how I looked at it, the conclusion was the same. I couldn't go back. I couldn't let myself get pulled into their mess, no matter how much they tried to guilt me into it. But deep down, I also knew this wasn't over. My parents weren't the type to give up easily, and something told me they still had a few cards left to play. A week passed after Ethan's call, and for the first time in a while, things felt quiet. Too quiet. I hadn't heard from my parents since I stopped replying to their messages, and even Ethan had gone silent. It should have felt like relief, like I had finally carved out some space for myself, but instead, it felt like the calm before a storm. There was this lingering tension, this feeling in the pit of my stomach that told me something else was coming. And of course, I was right. One evening, I got home from work and found a letter in my mailbox. A real, physical letter. Who even sends letters anymore? The second I saw my mom's handwriting on the envelope, my stomach dropped. I stood there in my apartment doorway, the unopened letter in my hand, staring at it like it was going to explode. Part of me wanted to toss it straight into the trash without reading it, but curiosity, or maybe guilt, got the better of me. Inside, the letter was several pages long. My mom's handwriting was neat and deliberate, but the words themselves felt heavy, almost suffocating. She started with the usual guilt trip, talking about how disappointed they were in me, how they couldn't understand why I was being so cold and distant. She wrote about how they had always done their best for me, how hard it had been to juggle everything with Ethan and Sarah, and how they had assumed I was fine because I didn't act out like the others. That part stung more than I wanted to admit. I wasn't fine. I had never been fine. I had just learned how to keep quiet about it because I knew there was no room for me in their chaos. But then the letter took a turn. She started talking about the future, about what would happen to Ethan and Sarah if something happened to them. My parents weren't getting any younger, and according to her, my dad's health was declining faster than they'd let on. She said they needed someone they could trust to step in and be there when they no longer could. And apparently, that someone was supposed to be me. I felt sick. It wasn't even a request. It was written like a foregone conclusion, like they had already decided this was my role whether I liked it or not. She said they had been talking about legal guardianship, about setting up financial plans, and about how it would just make sense for me to take over. There was no acknowledgement of how big of an ask this was. No apology for springing it on me out of nowhere. Just expectation, coated in flowery words and emotional blackmail. At the very end of the letter, she wrote, "We're not asking for much, Emily. Just for you to step up and do the right thing for your family." I folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and sat down on my couch. My hands were shaking. For days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I tried to focus on something else, work, a book, a TV show, my brain would drag me back to that letter, to the weight of those words. They weren't asking me to help out occasionally or to visit more often. They were asking me to take responsibility for two adult siblings with lifelong needs. They wanted me to put my entire life on hold, move back home, and clean up the mess they had spent decades ignoring. I talked it over with Maddie and Zoe again. Maddie was gentle about it, offering sympathetic nods and thoughtful advice. Zoe, as usual, cut straight to the point. "This isn't about love, Em. This isn't about them wanting you to be part of the family. This is about them needing someone to carry the weight they don't want to deal with anymore. And they've decided that someone is you because you're the only one who made it out." I knew she was right. I knew. But it didn't make it any easier. I debated whether to respond to the letter, to lay it all out in clear terms. "I will not do this. I will not be your backup plan." But every time I sat down to write a reply, I froze. What was the point? They wouldn't hear me. They'd twist my words, find a way to make me feel like the villain again, and I wasn't strong enough to go through another round of that. Instead, I shoved the letter into a drawer and tried to move on. But then, a few days later, I got another call. This time from my sister Sarah. Sarah and I had never been close. She was always caught up in her own struggles. Hospital stays, therapy appointments, medications that never seemed to work quite right. I felt bad for her growing up, but there was always this wall between us, like we existed in two different worlds. "Hey," she said quietly when I picked up. Her voice sounded small, fragile, like she'd been crying. "I know you're mad at Mom and Dad. I know things are messy right now, but they're not doing well, Emily. Dad's health is getting worse, and Mom's barely holding it together." I closed my eyes and pressed my fingers to my temples. "They think you're the only one who can handle this," she continued. "The only one who's capable." That word again. Capable. Like stability was some sort of curse instead of something I had fought for. "Sarah, I'm sorry they're struggling," I said, my voice tight. "But this isn't fair. They've had years to figure this out. They've had decades. And now they're dumping it on me because they didn't plan for any of this." There was silence on the other end of the line. "I can't fix this," I said finally. "I won't. I have my own life now, Sarah. I can't just drop everything and move back home to clean up their mess." "I know," she said softly. "But what happens if you don't? What happens to Ethan? What happens to me?" Her voice cracked on that last word, and it nearly broke me. "I'm sorry," I whispered. We stayed on the phone for another minute, both of us silent, both of us carrying weights we weren't meant to hold. When we finally hung up, I felt hollow. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the heaviness in my chest. I knew Sarah wasn't trying to manipulate me. She was just scared. Scared of what would happen to her, scared of being abandoned. And for a moment, I felt like a terrible person for not rushing in to save her. But then I remembered all those years of being invisible. All those nights alone in my room while chaos consumed the rest of the house. All those times I needed my parents, and they weren't there for me. I wasn't going to sacrifice my future because my parents refused to plan for theirs. But deep down, I also knew this wasn't over. Not yet. A couple of weeks passed without any new messages, letters, or calls. It was almost eerie, like the silence was holding its breath, waiting for the next blow to land. I tried to enjoy the peace, to let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, they'd finally given up. But deep down, I knew better. My parents didn't know how to let go of something once they'd sunk their claws into it. One evening, I came home from work to find another envelope in my mailbox. No return address, just my name scrawled in my dad's sharp, all-caps handwriting. I stared at it for a moment before taking it inside, dropping my bag by the door, and sitting at the kitchen table. I opened it carefully, half expecting some explosive emotional tirade. But instead, it was short, almost clinical. It said that my dad's health had taken a sharp decline, that the doctors were saying it might not be long now, and that if I wanted to see him, I should come home soon. That was it. No guilt trip, no accusations, just cold, hard facts. And somehow, that hurt more than anything else. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the letter. I thought about my dad, Mark, the man who had spent my entire childhood being a distant, shadowy figure in the background. He had always been a stern man, not cruel, not violent, but cold. He spoke to us like we were employees rather than his kids, and his approval had always felt impossible to earn. I couldn't remember the last time he'd said he was proud of me, or if he ever had at all. The idea of going back, of walking into that house, of being surrounded by the ghosts of all those years of silence and neglect, it made my skin crawl. But at the same time, there was this tiny voice in the back of my head whispering, "What if you regret not going? What if this is your last chance?" I called Maddie and Zoe that night. Maddie, ever the calm one, said I needed to make the choice that felt right for me, not for them. Zoe, on the other hand, was more direct. "If you go back there, they'll pull you in. You know they will. You'll walk into that house and walk out carrying their mess on your back." I knew she was right. I knew exactly how it would go. But the guilt was eating me alive. In the end, I compromised with myself. I wouldn't go back home, but I would call my dad. At the very least, I could give him that much. The next day, I sat on my couch, phone in hand, my stomach in knots as I dialed his number. It rang a few times before he picked up. "Hello?" His voice sounded weaker than I remembered, thinner somehow. "Hey, Dad. It's me, Emily." There was a pause, just a beat too long, and then he said, "Oh, Emily. Hi." It was the most awkward conversation of my life. We stumbled over small talk for a few minutes. Work, the weather, generic nonsense. And then he said something that made my heart twist. "You know, your mother's really struggling with all this. She's carrying a lot on her shoulders." There it was. The shift. The angle. This wasn't about him wanting to hear my voice or connect with me. This was about setting up the next guilt trip, making sure I knew how hard things were for Mom, how unfair it was that she had to bear all this alone. I took a deep breath. "Dad, I'm sorry you're going through this. I really am. But I can't come back. I can't fix this for you." There was silence on the other end of the line. For a second, I thought he might have hung up. But then he spoke, his voice low and strained. "I didn't want it to turn out like this, Emily." That was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from him. And maybe it wasn't even an apology. Maybe it was just regret, or fear, or exhaustion. But it was something. We said goodbye not long after, and I sat there with the phone in my lap, staring at the blank screen, feeling like I'd been hollowed out. A week later, the silence broke again. But this time, it wasn't through a letter or a phone call. It was my mother. On my doorstep. It was a Saturday morning, and I was still in my pajamas, clutching a mug of coffee when the knock came. I opened the door, and there she was. Rachel, my mother, standing on my porch with a tight smile and tired eyes. She looked smaller than I remembered, like life itself had been slowly shrinking her down. "Emily," she said, her voice soft but firm, "we need to talk." I didn't invite her in. Instead, I stepped outside, closing the door behind me, and crossed my arms over my chest. "You came all this way just to talk?" I asked. She let out a sigh and shook her head. "Your father's not doing well. He doesn't have much time left. And I can't do this alone anymore." There it was. The plea. The weight of expectation wrapped in vulnerability. "Mom, I'm sorry about Dad. I really am. But I can't come back. I can't be what you want me to be." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I felt like the worst person in the world. But then she said something that snapped me back into reality. "We did the best we could, Emily. You have no idea how hard it was, raising all of you, keeping everything together. We didn't have time for you because we were trying to survive." I felt my stomach turn. "No, Mom. You chose not to have time for me. You chose to focus on everything else because I wasn't causing problems. And now, you're here asking me to fix everything because I'm the only one who managed to build something stable out of the mess you left behind." Her face crumpled, and she looked away, wiping at her eyes. But I wasn't done. You don't get to show up now and ask me to set myself on fire to keep everyone else warm. You don't get to guilt me into this. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. We just stood there, the cold morning air hanging heavy between us. Finally, she whispered, "So that's it? You're just done with us?" I shook my head. "No, Mom. You were done with me a long time ago. I'm just finally realizing it." She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She just turned and walked back to her car. I stood there on the porch and watched her go, my chest tight and my throat burning, but deep down, there was also a flicker of relief. I had said what I needed to say, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. But I also knew this wasn't over. Not yet. There was still one more storm on the horizon. I could feel it coming. A few weeks passed after my mother showed up at my doorstep, and for the first time in months, things felt still. The silence wasn't exactly peaceful. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like a fog hanging low over everything. I kept waiting for another shoe to drop, another text, another letter, another surprise visit. But nothing came. It was just quiet. I tried to settle back into my routine. Work, dinner with Maddie and Zoe, weekends spent catching up on sleep and errands. Life moved forward, but it felt like there was something unfinished, something unresolved, lingering in the back of my mind. I'd replay my last conversation with my mom over and over, analyzing every word, every pause. Part of me still felt guilty, even though I knew I shouldn't. Then, one Friday evening, I got a text from an unknown number. "Hey, Emily. It's Jake. Call me when you can." Jake, my oldest brother. We hadn't spoken in years, not really spoken anyway. The occasional birthday text, maybe a quick exchange of pleasantries if we crossed paths at a family event. But that was it. He was always distant, always half-checked out of conversations. Growing up, I used to think he was the one sibling I might actually connect with, but he had his own issues, his own messes, and I had long since given up trying to bridge the gap. I stared at the text for a while, debating whether to respond. Finally, I typed out, "What's going on?" He replied almost immediately. "It's about Dad. Please, just call me." I sighed and dialed his number. He picked up on the second ring. "Emily," he said, his voice tired and strained. "Thanks for calling." "What's going on, Jake?" "It's Dad. It's bad. Really bad. The doctors don't think he has much time left." I closed my eyes and let his words sink in. I'd been expecting this. Ever since my mom's visit, I'd been bracing myself for this exact moment. But hearing it out loud still hit like a punch to the stomach. "Okay," I said softly. "I'm sorry, Jake. I really am." He let out a long breath on the other end of the line. "Look, I'm not calling to guilt you into coming home or anything. I know how things are between you and Mom and Dad. But I just thought you'd want to know." I appreciated that he wasn't pushing me, that he wasn't trying to manipulate me the way my parents had. But that didn't make this any easier. "Are you okay?" I asked him. He laughed bitterly. "No, not really, but I'm handling it." We talked for a few more minutes, small talk, awkward silences, him trying to explain how bad things had gotten at home without outright saying it. By the time we hung up, I felt drained. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about my dad, about the way he'd sounded on the phone the last time we spoke. Small, tired, regretful. I thought about my mom, about the weight she must have been carrying all these years, even if it was partially her own fault. And I thought about Jake, who sounded so worn down it made my chest ache. The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to move back home. I wasn't going to let myself get pulled into their mess. But I would go back to see my dad. Just once. Just to say goodbye. I booked a flight for the following weekend and let Jake know I was coming. I didn't tell my mom. I didn't want her to have time to prepare a scene, to set up some emotional ambush. I just wanted to see my dad, have whatever conversation I could manage with him, and leave. The flight felt endless. My stomach was in knots the entire time, and by the time I landed and rented a car, I felt like I was running on fumes. The drive to my parents' house was surreal. Everything looked smaller than I remembered. The trees, the old gas station on the corner, the neighborhood itself. It was like I'd stepped into a diorama of my childhood. a scaled-down version of a place I'd spent years trying to forget. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same. Same chipped paint on the shutters, same crooked mailbox. It was like time had frozen here while I'd been away. I sat in the car for a long time before I finally forced myself to get out. My mom answered the door, and the look of shock on her face almost made me turn around and leave right then and there. "Emily," she said, her voice trembling. "You came." "I'm here to see Dad," I said bluntly. She nodded quickly and stepped aside. The smell of the house hit me instantly, a mix of old wood, stale air, and faint antiseptic. It was the smell of sickness, of waiting. My dad was in a hospital bed set up in the living room. He looked so much smaller than I remembered, so much more fragile. His skin was pale and thin, his eyes sunken. He looked up when I walked in, and for a second, there was a flicker of something in his expression. Relief, maybe, or regret. "Emily," he said softly. His voice was barely a whisper. "Hey, Dad." I sat down in the chair next to his bed, and for a few moments, neither of us said anything. I could hear the faint hum of the oxygen machine, the ticking of the clock on the wall. "I didn't think you'd come," he said finally. "Yeah, well, I'm here." He nodded slightly, his head sinking back into the pillow. "I'm sorry, Emily, for everything. I should have been better. I should have been more present." His words were halting, broken up by ragged breaths, but they felt genuine, and I realized, sitting there in that dimly lit room, that this was probably as close to an apology as I was ever going to get. "I know, Dad," I said quietly. "I know." We sat together for a while longer. He dozed off a few times, his breathing shallow and uneven. I stayed until he fell into a deeper sleep, then quietly stood up and left the room. My mom was in the kitchen when I walked in. She looked at me with tear-streaked cheeks and this hollow expression that made her look so much older than she was. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. I didn't reply. I just grabbed my bag, walked out the front door, and got back into my car. As I drove away from the house, I felt a strange sense of closure. Not peace, exactly, but something close to it. I'd said goodbye. I'd heard the words I needed to hear. And now, I could go home. Not to their home, but to my home, to the life I'd built for myself far away from all of this. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was running away. I felt like I was finally walking away, on my own terms. The weeks after my visit home felt like coming up for air after nearly drowning. I didn't tell Maddie or Zoe much about what happened, just that I'd seen my dad, that we talked, and that I felt done. They didn't push for more details, which I appreciated. They could tell I was still processing it all, and honestly, I wasn't even sure how to explain what I felt. It wasn't closure, not really. It wasn't forgiveness either. It was just over. Or at least, I thought it was. About a month later, I got an email from Jake. "Dad passed away last night. I thought you'd want to know." That was it. No long explanation, no emotional outpouring. Just one simple sentence. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, rereading those words over and over again. I'd known this was coming. I'd prepared myself for it. But knowing something is inevitable doesn't mean you're ready when it happens. I didn't cry. I didn't feel much of anything at first, if I'm being honest. There was just this dull numbness, like someone had thrown a heavy blanket over my emotions. I typed out a reply, "Thanks for letting me know. I'm sorry for your loss," and hit send. That was all I could offer. A few days later, Jake called me. I hesitated before answering, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hey," he said, his voice scratchy, like he hadn't been sleeping well. "Hey," I replied. There was a long pause before he spoke again. "We're having a memorial service next weekend. Mom wanted me to ask if you'd come." The knot in my stomach tightened immediately. I don't know, Jake. Look, I'm not going to pressure you. I know things are complicated, but she asked me to let you know. And honestly, I think it would mean a lot to her if you were there. I felt a pang of something. Guilt, maybe, or obligation. But there was also anger simmering just under the surface. It felt like another expectation, another weight being quietly passed to me, wrapped in a bow of grief and tradition. "I'll think about it," I said finally. We hung up, and I sat there with my phone in my lap, staring at the screen like it might give me answers. Over the next few days, I kept turning it over in my mind. Should I go? Should I stay away? Would showing up just pull me back into the same cycle, the same web of guilt and manipulation? Or would it be one final chance to close the door on all of this, to see it through to the end and then walk away for good? In the end, I decided to go. Not for my mom, not even for Jake. I went for myself. The day of the memorial, I drove back to my hometown. The church was small and quiet, with stained glass windows that cast colored light across the worn wooden pews. People were already gathered when I arrived. Family friends, distant relatives, neighbors I barely recognized. When I walked in, a few heads turned, and I felt the weight of their eyes on me. I could almost hear their thoughts. There's Emily, the daughter who moved away, the one who wasn't around. My mom was near the front, sitting next to Jake. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she looked so small, so fragile. When she saw me, her lips pressed together, and for a second, I thought she might cry again. But she didn't. She just nodded slightly, acknowledging me, and then turned her attention back to the front. I sat near the back, away from everyone else. The service was short. Some hymns, a few words from the pastor, and then Jake stood up to speak. He talked about my dad's hard work, his dedication to the family, how he always did what he thought was right. He mentioned his flaws, too, but only briefly, like they were footnotes in an otherwise admirable story. It wasn't untrue, but it wasn't the whole truth either. After the service, there was a small reception in the church hall. People milled around with cups of coffee and trays of finger food, murmuring polite condolences. I stayed near the edge of the room, avoiding eye contact, hoping no one would come up to me. But, of course, my mom did. She approached slowly, her hands clutching a tissue, her face tight with exhaustion. "Emily," she said softly. "Mom." We stood there for a moment, both of us unsure of what to say. "Thank you for coming," she said finally. I nodded. "I'm sorry for your loss." Her lips trembled, and for a second, I thought she might let something real slip through. A real apology, real vulnerability. But instead, she said, "He loved you, you know, in his own way." I bit back the bitter laugh that rose in my throat. In his own way. What does that even mean? In the way where he ignored me for years? In the way where he only reached out when he needed something from me? But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I just said, "I know." She nodded, like she was relieved by my answer, and then she turned and walked away. I stayed for another half hour, said goodbye to Jake, and then left. The drive home felt different this time. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel guilty. I just felt done. Like I had finally closed a chapter that had been left open for far too long. Over the next few weeks, I didn't hear from my mom. No calls, no texts, no letters. I think, in her own way, she understood that this was it, that whatever fragile connection we still had been stretched too thin to hold anymore. Jake texted me once, just to check in, and I replied. But it was brief, polite. We weren't suddenly going to become close siblings just because of a funeral, and that was okay. I went back to my life, back to Maddie and Zoe, back to my routines, back to my little apartment that felt more like home than the house I grew up in ever did. Sometimes, late at night, I'd think about my dad, about my mom, about the family I had been born into versus the family I had chosen for myself. But those thoughts didn't hurt as much anymore. They didn't carry the same weight. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was standing on solid ground, ground that I had built for myself, piece by piece, brick by brick, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me again.